Well, thanks for joining us for today's webinar. Sweet dreams are made of these strategies for improving your sleep. And how about that title? Thank you so much, Dr. Hayes, for that. I'm Greg Berry, Director of Communications in the Office of Alumni Affairs. Since we're coming to you virtually, please excuse technical issues or glitches that may pop up. If you experience problems with video or audio, click the reconnect button on your screen to get back to the webinar right away. A quick note, we are recording today's webinar. A replay will be made available on our website by tomorrow. Today, we welcome Dr. Megan Hayes back to the webinar series. Dr. Hayes is an associate professor and rehabilitation psychologist in the UAB Hearsing School of Medicine. After earning her bachelor's degree in 2008 from the University of North Carolina, Dr. Hayes obtained her Master of Arts in 2013 and PhD in 2016, both in clinical psychology from the University of South Florida. Dr. Hayes was with us last November for Beating the Burnout, Strategies for Finding Joy in Your Job and Life Again. You can take a look back at that webinar and all of our webinars at alumni.uab.edu/videos. At this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Hayes for today's presentation. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you so much, Greg. I'm going to attempt to share my screen again, so you just let me know that you can see it. That's the necessary pandemic, post-pandemic question.
It sure is. Yes, we can see it and you're all set.
All right. And you can hear me, right?
Sure can.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks again for having me back to this webinar series. I'm very excited to talk to everyone today about one of my personal favorite topics, which is sleep. I always joke that I could talk about sleep in my sleep. It's one of my favorite things to share with folks, as I know a lot of people struggle with it. And we've certainly seen an increase in the number of people having difficulty sleeping since the pandemic back in 2020. So that being said, I'm going to try to share some insights with you all. My background is as a clinical psychologist. I have a lot of experience providing something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and you'll learn a little bit more about that today, but I also have a lot of experience working with healthcare workers and coaching them on some of their sleep difficulties that they encounter as well. So that's just a little bit about where I come from with this interest. So today what I'd like to do is first talk to you all about some of the evidence that we know regarding what the health risks are, and as well as some of the quality of life issues that can happen when a person doesn't have sufficient sleep. I also want to talk with you guys about the unique contributions that our sleep quality have to our mood as well as our body weight. So weight management is another popular area that I get asked about in the health sector as being a psychologist in this area. And so I do want to you guys to leave understanding how sleep is a really important modulator of neuroendocrine function, our glucose metabolism, and our appetite regulation, which of course impacts our body weight. I want to talk to you all about some common sleep problems that can happen, as well as sleep disorders. And those are two different things, but I want to just clarify for you all. I also, and I put this in bold because this is where I want to spend most of my time, I want to offer you guys some tools for your toolkit for improving and optimizing your sleep that you can leave with today and start trying immediately. I feel like these webinars are the most useful for folks when there's practical tips that you can start today with very minimal barriers to getting started. And of course, I also want to spend some time on questions and answers, because there's no way I could cover all of the things I really wanted to cover in this presentation and webinar. So I'm just hopeful that if you do have a burning question at the end, that you'll let me know, and then I can spend some time going into some of the areas that I missed. So first of all, we'll talk a little bit about prevalence of sleep issue. So about 35.4% of all adults, so a little over 1/3, report sleeping on average less than 7 hours per night. One question I get asked a lot is, how much sleep do we need? Well, it can differ person to person. It also differs as we age. So infants need a lot more sleep, right, than anybody does. And teenagers and adolescents also need much more sleep than adults. But as we get to, the adult age range, the CDC recommendation is for between 7 to 9 hours per night. But obviously, we can see that a lot of people are sleeping less than that. And even before the pandemic, we had about 50 to 70 million Americans with a sleep disorder, with the most common one being chronic insomnia. but that number seems to be increasing. And since the pandemic, about 2 in 3 Americans are reporting sleeping either more or less than desired. And that's from research from the Stress in America survey from the American Psychological Association. So why is this such a big deal? Well, what I'm about to talk with you all about in terms of health risk is not meant to scare you, but I do hope that it will help you to prioritize sleep. I hear a lot of people saying, well, just got a lot to do. I'm so busy. Sleep is more of a luxury, right? But you'll see in some of this evidence that it's really not a luxury and it's something that we should prioritize. But if you are having trouble sleeping, please don't use this as another reason that you should have anxiety about your sleep. And I'll talk more about that later. So the first cost, if you will, of poor sleep or health risk is related to blood pressure. So research has demonstrated that even one single night of insufficient sleep in people with hypertension can cause elevated blood pressure throughout the next day. So we know that if you already have elevated blood pressure, that it's going to make it worse the next day, even after just one night of not enough sleep. We also are seeing a growing evidence of a connection between obstructive sleep apnea and heart disease. And the reason for that is that people with sleep apnea typically experience multiple awakenings each night as a result of the closing of their airway when they fall asleep. In addition to these sleep disturbances, those with sleep apnea also experience brief surges in their blood pressure each time that they wake up. So over time, this can lead to a chronic elevation of blood pressure, also known as hypertension, which is a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease. But fortunately, when sleep apnea is treated, blood pressure may go down, but that's just something to be aware of. Even a single sleepless night can cause us to be irritable and moody the next day. I'm sure all of us on this call have experienced that. I know that I have. But it's conceivable that with chronic missed opportunities for sleep, with insufficient sleep over time, that there could be a relationship between that and mood disorders in the long term. So we know that those who have chronic deficit in their sleep do have more of a propensity to develop mood and anxiety disorders or exacerbate existing ones. I also know from experience, and many on the call may, that sleep is critical for optimal cognitive functioning. So it is necessary for memory, paying attention, making decisions, coping with change, as well as our emotions. So we know that even one 24-hour period without sleep, that a person is functioning cognitively with about a 0.10 BAC. Okay, so that's over the legal limit of alcohol consumption. So I always find that statistic very interesting, and that's why you've seen a widespread campaign by the CDC, and many governments have picked up on this about not driving while drowsy, because the impact is just about the same, if not worse sometimes, than buzz drinking. I put a little note about Alzheimer's disease there because, interestingly enough, we're also seeing that insufficient sleep can accelerate Alzheimer's disease and the memory deficits that are associated with it by causing more of the tau protein to spread in those toxic plaques or tangles you may have heard about within those brain areas that are important for memory. So it does accelerate the course of Alzheimer's disease and may even put us at risk for it if we already have a predisposition. Sleep, of course, is very important for the immune function. You may have noticed that when you just have been run down lately and not getting enough sleep, it seems like you're getting every virus out there, getting cold after cold, just things popping up with your gums. And that is, definitely no surprise, right? So there is that link in the research between insufficient sleep and poor immune functioning. And along those lines, having a chronic deficit in our sleep, chronically insufficient sleep, can also put us at risk for certain cancers or increase our risk of having those. I put alcohol here because there is a connection between those who are not getting enough sleep and drinking alcohol. The reason for that connection is probably because people use alcohol as a way to try to help them fall asleep if they're struggling in that area. But with that form of self-medication or using it as a quote-unquote sleep aid, as you'll learn later, alcohol does significantly reduce the quality of our sleep, and it can lead to its own issues, of course. If you're using alcohol night after night to try to help you as a sleep aid, you'll need more and more of it to work, and it can lead to an alcohol use disorder in and of its own. Diabetes and metabolic syndrome. Research has found that poor sleep may lead to type 2 diabetes by influencing the way that our body processes glucose. So we've seen in research that adults who slept less than 5 hours per night have a greatly increased risk of developing diabetes. Also, researchers have associated sleep apnea with the development of impaired glucose control, similar to what occurs in diabetes. So it really messes with your glucose regulation to not sleep enough. Obesity, I'm going to put a pin in that one because that one really deserves some special attention, and I'm going to talk about that more in the next slide. And life expectancy. So given all of these potential adverse effects of insufficient sleep, it makes sense, and it's not surprising that poor sleep is associated with a lower life expectancy. Of course, I mean chronically poor sleep. And this is usually related to sleeping 5 or less hours per average night. And that does increase mortality risk by about 15%, according to what we've seen in some of the larger epidemiology studies. So let's talk about sleep and body weight. So multiple studies have linked insufficient sleep with weight gain. If you've tried to lose weight before and you're not sleeping enough, this may be something that is getting in your way. And the reason for that is that when we don't sleep enough, we see some changes in the hormones that help to regulate how we process glucose, as I mentioned previously, as well as our hunger and fullness cues and our stress hormones. So one thing we see with a night of insufficient sleep is the next day, people have an increase in their cortisol, or what's called often as the stress hormone. We know that stress hormone is very much implicated in obesity, and maybe one day of this is not a big deal, but day after day, if that cortisol is elevated, it will certainly make it difficult to lose weight and can help you to gain weight. We also see secretion of insulin after a meal increasing. So if you didn't sleep well the night before and you eat a meal, you're going to secrete more insulin than if you had had a good night of sleep. And that's a problem because it promotes fat storage. We also see lower levels of leptin, which leptin is a satiety hormone. It tells us that we are full. So you're getting the signal that you're not full, even though you may be if you haven't had enough sleep. And along those lines, we're also seeing higher levels of the hormone ghrelin, which is our hunger hormone. That tells us that we are hungry. So these hormones are dysregulated. So what does this mean for us? It means that we're going to have food cravings even when we've had enough calories, which means we're eating more. We're also more likely to eat foods with sugar, simple carbohydrates. If you're a salty person, this might be chips, right? Things like that, crackers, that satisfy the craving for quick energy, right? Most of us are not binge eating on kale when we've had a bad night of sleep, just to put it into context. You just think about what you would normally crave, and it's usually not the healthiest per se of foods. We're also less likely to exercise when we are tired, right? It makes a lot of sense. You've had a rough night of sleep. It can be difficult to have the motivation and the initiation to get up and go to the gym. So all of this combined can certainly put you at a disadvantage for trying to lose weight and can actually increase BMI. So we know that those who sleep 8 hours or more tend to have the lowest BMI, and that those who sleep 6 hours or less are much more likely to have a higher than average body mass index. So one thing that I like to distinguish is sleep problems versus sleep disorders. And a lot of people that I've worked with don't necessarily have a sleep disorder, but they have some problems that can impact their sleep from time to time. And before I even get into these, I want to clarify that having a night or two of poor sleep is completely normal, right? We all go through phases where we're really just tossing and turning all night long. It might be that we had an exciting day, we've got a lot going on in our personal lives, we are having a very normal reaction to stressors. That is not an issue. It's really over the long term where problems or disorders can develop and be an issue for us. So one issue I hear a lot about our sleep problem is just poor quality sleep. Sometimes you'll go through a period of time like this because you're in maybe chronic pain, pain's interfering with your sleep, or you're having acute pain from an accident or something like that. Your bed partner is snoring, right? I know I've experienced that firsthand. Or you may just be having some anxiety that you're dealing with, which can come in waves with ups and downs. Frequent awakenings are also common, although I want to normalize that awakenings are a very normal and healthy part of sleep. A lot of times people panic about awakenings. It's really pretty normal in our sleep architecture to wake up multiple times a night. We just don't remember a lot of those, and we may remember one or two, and that's also not a problem. But it's something that if it does take you a long time to fall back asleep, could be an issue for you, especially if it's bothering you. Night shift work and the number of hours people have to work. I see this a lot in the healthcare system. People are just kind of forced into a circadian rhythm that really doesn't work for them. And so that can sometimes cause some sleep problems. Emotion regulation is another issue. Sometimes this could be due to work-related factors or a work-related syndrome called burnout. Trauma reactions. So people can be exposed to trauma. We are all often exposed to trauma in our lives, and you can be having a very normal reaction of processing trauma that's not PTSD, but may disrupt your sleep while you're trying to figure that out. Just trouble falling or staying asleep can happen. Doesn't necessarily meet the criteria for insomnia, but it bothers you sometimes. Another issue that we've seen a lot since the pandemic, and although that's kind of improving now, it's just kind of this gradually waking up and falling asleep earlier. And a lot of people, when they were in confinement, saw this more. Now that we're kind of out and about, it's less likely to happen, but we do still see this syndrome with more like students, retirees, people who work from home and have a lot of flexibility in their work schedule. They may just have this tendency to kind of gradually fall asleep later and, wake up later as a result. So, and this can interfere with social connection as well, because if you're sleeping in a lot, you're sleeping in until, 10, 11, 12, your opportunities to spend time with other people who are on kind of a more work schedule, right? A work day schedule may be more limited. So that can cause some problems. In terms of what sleep disorders are common, I feel like this is a nice graphic to summarize some of those. Just to hit the highlights, of course, by far, insomnia tends to be one of the most common sleep disorders. That's characterized by trouble falling asleep at night, lying awake for long periods of time, waking up several times during the night, waking up unable to go back to sleep. You're not feeling refreshed. You tend to have irritability, and this tends to go on for a long period of time. Of course, sleep apnea is very common as well. We see, restless legs interfering with sleep. So restless leg disorder being another one, and narcolepsy. All of those are pretty common, but also circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorders are really common, especially in certain jobs. So people who have to, they're basically forced to work in a certain time period when their body would naturally prefer or would naturally be falling asleep, and so it can cause a shift in circadian rhythm that cause disrupted sleep when they are trying to sleep. So that happens a lot with healthcare workers and shift workers in general. So there are certain sleep disturbances, like the ones on the last slide, that are going to require further evaluation and treatment by specialists. And I just wanted to put this out there, that PSA, that those who do want medical evaluation for those severe sleep concerns, maybe you're falling asleep throughout the day, even in dangerous situations like when you're driving a car, right? Then the sleep education, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine has a website where there's a searchable database where you can find a sleep center near you. You can just type in your zip code, you can put a radius, and it'll tell you where your closest sleep center is, where you could get a sleep study to be evaluated for things like sleep apnea. And here at UAB, we do have the Sleep Wake Disorder Center, which is accredited by the AASM. So that is a great resource if you're local to get a sleep study, but the wait can be a minute. So make sure you go ahead and get on that wait list if that's something that you're concerned about. And now we're kind of going to be moving into more of the strategies, right? And one thing that I wanted to point out to you all is that this cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI for short, has very strong recommendations, and it has strong, robust evidence base for helping with insomnia. And this is, again, something that a lot of psychologists are able to provide, but sometimes you'll see social workers, like clinical social workers or nurses, able to provide this intervention as well. And a lot of the strategies that I'm going to talk about today come from this intervention. And I put this slide up from the American College of Physicians just to show that CBTI is actually the first line recommended treatment for chronic insomnia disorder. Please note that pills, sleeping pills, are not the first recommendation, even by physicians, right? So this is a very strong evidence base, and it's something that I want people to consider, because I think it's easy to want a quick fix, to want a quick way to fix your sleep, but sleeping pills have their own set of problems that I'm not going to fully get into today. If people have questions, I can try to answer them at the end. I'm also not a psychiatrist, right? I'm a psychologist, so it's hard for me to go in depth, about the medications. But I did just want to point out that it's not the first line, right? So really that first line is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And before you even go that far to need that formalized treatment, I'm hoping some of these skills today could give you some tools in your toolkit to work on this. And if you're still having issues, maybe to consider a more formalized CBTI. This is just a 3P model of insomnia that I wanted to point out to you guys. When we're treating insomnia, if that's something you are dealing with chronically, we're addressing the certain factors, right? With insomnia, we have, first of all, predisposing factors that make it more likely we're going to deal with insomnia. It may be our genetic makeup, certain biological traits about us, certain psychological traits that we have, as well as some social factors. And then there's some precipitating factors that can really set that chronic insomnia off if you have that predisposition. It may be something like a medical illness interfering with your sleep. It may be a psychiatric concern, something like major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety or PTSD, and stressful life events, right? That can, sometimes the birth of a new child, for example, the death of a family member can really set off the insomnia. But then there's things that perpetuate it, right? And that's that third P. This is like things like excessive time spent in the bed that you're not sleeping, napping, trying to make up for lost sleep, or generally just conditioning your brain that the bed is a place to toss and turn and not a place to sleep. And that is where these cognitive behavioral strategies and, more formalized CBTI can really make a big difference, because we can address some of those perpetuating factors that keep this going when it really doesn't have to. So let's go ahead and move into some evidence-based tips. A lot of these based on cognitive behavioral therapy, but a lot of them also just based on the literature in general. What can we do to make our sleep better? My first tip is to get the lighting right. Light plays a key role in how we sleep, and light is the primary synchronizer of our circadian rhythm, which is our roughly 24-hour internal clock. But not all light is the same, right? So blue light, which I know is very popular these days, even blue blocking glasses and things like that. But blue light is actually not a bad thing, all right? Hear me out. Blue light is actually very helpful during the day, which is why I don't recommend people wear blue light blockers glasses during the daytime. The more we get during the day, the better, actually. So getting exposure to a lot of bright blue spectrum light during the daytime helps to promote a restful night's sleep, because it cues the body into wakefulness and energy expenditure during the day. Conversely, dim, soft light on the red spectrum of light helps signal to the brain and the body that it's time to wind down and relax. Think candlelight, low light lamps, and of course they even make, I know I've got one from Amazon, these red spectrum night lights and things like that. And darkness facilitates natural melatonin production, which is a hormone in our body. It is often called the vampire hormone because it really is only produced in the evening for the most part, or that's when most of it is produced. So the conditions need to be dark in order to produce melatonin. So what does this mean for you? One thing you can do right off the bat if you're having trouble sleeping is making sure you're getting exposure to bright light during the daytime and as much as possible. I recommend trying to aim for about 30 minutes of natural sunlight daily. If that is not possible due to your job or due to the shift that you work, you can also just try a high quality broad spectrum lamp, often called SAD lamps. And you can do that within the first 30 minutes of waking, 30 minutes to an hour of waking. You can sit in front of that for about 20 to 30 minutes, and that can also do the trick. But ideally, you would get that natural sunlight. You can also get that in the car if you have like a long commute, but ideally you would also just get a lot of sunlight streaming into your eye line, right? Because it's filtered through the eyes. You also want to try to disconnect for devices for about 1 to 2 hours before bedtime. You all have probably heard about this, but that's not even as important actually as the exposure to light during the day. Really, that's the number one thing with lighting, because our circadian rhythm is pretty smart, right? The systems that help regulate that, and it can adapt to the modern world. If you're having trouble sleeping, I still recommend trying to disconnect from your devices a couple hours, 1 or 2 before bed. But really, as long as you're getting a lot of bright light during the day, your brain kind of knows, right, the difference between that daytime and even that nighttime screen time. But still, I would try to avoid it as much as you can. Also, transitioning into that red spectrum or warm light in the evening and ultimately darkness as pitch black as possible will help with melatonin production. My second tip is to get regular. So one thing I wanted to point out is that there are different sleep chronotypes. And some people are more like larks, right? Early birds. And those are people who prefer to go to bed early and wake up early. That kind of is just their natural rhythm. And about 40% of us are larks, or more early birds, if you will. About 30% of the population are night owls. And those are people who prefer, of course, that later bedtime and a later rising time. And night owls really get a bad rap because, in our society, oftentimes those business hours are something like 8 to 5. And that doesn't always work that great for night owls. But they really can't help it because the sleep chronotype is largely genetically determined. And then we have about 30% of people who are somewhere in between. That being said, the body likes and rewards regularity. So you want your behavioral patterns to align as much as possible with your circadian rhythm. So whatever your chronotype, you want to get regular and align your behaviors with your endogenous or natural circadian rhythm. That's why as a natural lark, I've ensured that my schedule allows me to get the REM sleep I need by just starting and ending my day earlier, even if it means I go to sleep a lot earlier than my partner. I tend to go to bed around like 9 o'clock, right? Which is pretty early, but I also wake up around 5 a.m. and that's what works best for me. But if you have more of a fixed schedule, try to determine which chronotype you are and try to make adjustments to your schedule to accommodate the natural rhythms of your body. So even if you're a night owl and you really can't move your hours worked, you still have to work that normal 8 to 5. What you can do is try to do the more cognitively challenging task in the late afternoon and evening when you're the sharpest, or vice versa. So kind of, work with your natural rhythm. If you're a lark, you can do the opposite of that. But we do know that a consistent wake cycle is associated with better health, right? And so we want the good news is, right, what does that mean for us? The good news is that you actually don't have to necessarily set a bedtime. But what you do want to do is schedule the same wake up time daily, even on the weekends, with about maybe 1 hour's time of wiggle room. I know that sounds really challenging, but it can very much pay off. And you don't need to put that pressure on yourself to go to bed at the same time daily, because once you set that same consistent wake up time, the bedtime will eventually take care of itself. And this means that you get up no matter what at the time that you have chosen, even if you didn't have a great night of sleep before. Over time, this effort will pay off by getting you a more regular circadian rhythm, and your brain will start to get sleepy at the right time to give you enough sleep each night. It just may take a week or two. All right, great. So we talked about having a routine and having regularity, which is so important. My third tip is to make sure that you're building sleep drive. So we all have this thing called a sleep drive, or like a sleep pressure, right? And it's like hunger. So just like the longer you go without eating, the more hungry you become. The longer you go without sleep, the more sleep drive you have. So one of the biggest contributors to sleep drive is just time. And having enough sleep drive built up means that you can cash in for a night of better sleep that night. What are some of the things that build sleep drive? We already talked about light. So having enough bright light during the day will help build that sleep pressure throughout the day. Exercise, a very important way to build sleep drive, which I'll discuss more later. And finally, regularity. And that's that important timing piece of waking up at the same time every day within about an hour's wiggle room, as we said, but like clockwork, right? You should be aiming to wake up at the same time every day, no matter what. What does this mean for you? Don't try to sleep in or go to bed early in order to make up for lost sleep. Just keep that consistent wake time. If you do try to make up for that lost sleep, what happens is the next day, maybe you've slept in a couple hours or 3 hours late, and the next night you won't have enough sleep pressure built up to go to sleep at the desired time, like the target time that you're trying to go to sleep. So you won't have built up that sleep pressure that you need. Also, don't go to bed until sleepy. A lot of people are actually going to bed too early. They're trying to force it. Sleepy means that your eyes are heavy and they seem to be kind of drifting shut. You're yawning. It's hard to concentrate on reading and writing maybe, and you're possibly even drifting off. And that's a lot different than just fatigue, where you feel just kind of worn out from the day. And very importantly, don't try to nap during the day if you are having sleep issues. Yes, some people are able to successfully have power naps for 10, 20, 30 minutes, but if you are having sleep issues, do not nap during the day, as this can cause issues with building up enough sleep pressure to cash in for a good night's sleep at night. My fourth tip is about sleep effort. One thing that I see a lot of patients come into my office is they've got pristine sleep hygiene sometimes, right? They're doing everything right by the book. They're getting light during the day, they're exercising and so on, but they're still having trouble falling asleep, and they are very fretful about it. So what's the deal there? Well, I have 2 words for you, and that is sleep effort, okay? One thing that I really want to drive home is that sleep is an involuntary thing, okay? You really can't force it. It is an involuntary biological process, and it definitely does not reward effort. So that means no matter how hard you try and no matter how frustrated you get and you're trying to toss and turn and you're trying to make everything perfect with your sleep, it's not going to force you to fall asleep, and in fact can backfire. So when this is happening and you do find yourself tossing and turning a lot, this skill of what we call stimulus control is extremely important, because what can happen is when you're tossing and turning a lot in the bed and you're spending a lot of the time in the bed not sleeping, you can have this thing called conditioned arousal, which is why the second you put your head down on the pillow, even if you were sleepy before, your brain is suddenly going over your to-do list and everything, all the worst memories that you have, right? And all of the worries and problems that are going on in your life. If you're dealing with that despite sleepiness, it could be that you have this conditioned arousal. So what we need to do is unlearn that and teach the brain that the bed is only for 2 things, which is sleep and sex. And I guess there's a third one, which is rest if you are sick, right? But what does this mean for you? Make sure to keep your sleep and wake environment separate. So do not spend a lot of time in your bed during the day doing things on your laptop, working on presentations, doing anything that's not sleeping, right? So just stay out of the bed during the daytime if at all possible. That also means that you want to get out of bed instead of tossing and turning when you are trying to sleep. So if it's been somewhere around like 20 to 30 minutes, go ahead and get up and get out of the bed. And if you have the luxury of getting out of your bedroom, do that as well. And just do something, right? Something else, something besides trying to sleep. You could listen to a podcast, you could read a book, you could do some chores, you can even look at a screen, right, on night mode. But just anything to kind of stop this effort of trying too hard to sleep. You want to distract essentially with some kind of low-key activity. And then the key is to not even try to go to bed until you feel those sleepy cues, that sleepy feeling that we talked about earlier. The fifth tip is quiet the mind. So stress and anxiety, of course, can interfere with sleep. And if you are having trouble sleeping and you're dealing with some increased stress and anxiety, this could be one reason why. One thing that I wanted to point out is that clock watching often causes more anxiety. So I don't have a clock in my bedroom. I don't look at my phone if I wake up in the middle of the night. And I would suggest that you do the same. Sleep is like landing a plane. I mentioned earlier, it's like an involuntary thing. We really can't force it, but we also can't just crash land into sleep. We have to kind of gradually get to that place where we're relaxed enough to go to sleep. What does this mean? What can we do today? One thing you could try is relaxation techniques or something like mindfulness before bed. But I do not recommend that you do this with the end goal only being to go to sleep, okay? That can actually cause a lot of frustration and you might be disappointed. If you want to meditate, right? It can help you to calm down potentially, but it's also not the end goal of meditation to relax. It can be a nice side effect, but it doesn't always happen. So if you're going into it thinking this is going to be a quick fix, stop, okay? But there has been some evidence that relaxing the body, doing things like guided imagery, pursed lip breathing, right, or breathing retraining, deep abdominal breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, a body scan might be able to help us. But you don't necessarily have to do this like as the last thing in your routine. You can also do it earlier in the evening or whenever you want. Another thing you can do is to download lingering thoughts from your brain to the paper. And this includes worries about your sleep. With insomnia, people tend to have catastrophic thinking about their sleep. They might think the day is going to be ruined. If they're only running on a few hours of sleep, they're not going to be able to function. They won't be able to take care of the kids or do things at work. And what this does is that it sets us up for this expectation that sleep has to be perfect and that we have to have the right amount of sleep every night, whereas that's really unrealistic. Of course, we can usually still function with a bad night of sleep. Maybe it's not optimal, but we can usually still get the things done that we need to do. So download those and try postponing that worry where you save those and you decide to worry about them for about 15 to 30 minutes the next day. Usually by the time you get to that worry window, you see those worries and you think, oh, that was just some catastrophic thinking I had last night. I don't even need to spend time worrying about that right now. Or if you do want to worry about some things, you'll be in a better mode to problem solve because you aren't as anxious about your sleep. You can also listen to an audiobook or a podcast to help quiet your mind. Exercise is extremely important for sleep pressure. So vigorous, moderate, or even mild cardiovascular exercise helps stimulate something called adenosine. And that is a chemical that is produced by the brain that helps to increase sleepiness. Adenosine helps to build sleep pressure. And of course, as we discussed, the more sleep pressure or drive that we have, we get better sleep. So this is just another great reason to increase your intrinsic motivation to exercise if you're struggling with a reason, well, why should I? I mean, we all know it's good for us, but if you're having trouble sleeping, it could be just what the doctor ordered. I put this note about avoid exercising too much in the evenings, but really, even within I would say just an hour, right? So if you're an evening worker outer, there really is no problem with this. And that myth that has been 4 hours has largely been debunked. So even if you're exercising fairly late at night, just give yourself an hour to wind down. And that should be sufficient because it's just the most important thing is that you exercise as much as you can. Also, having a pre-bedtime ritual has been found to be important. Again, we go back to that circadian rhythm. The brain likes and rewards regularity. So when we do the same relaxing thing every night, it signals to the body that it's time to settle down. We also know that the core body temperature needs to drop by about 2 or 3 degrees Fahrenheit to help us to maintain deep sleep. So many people think it's easier to fall asleep after your bath because the body, or like a shower, because the body's nice and toasty, but it's actually the opposite. So if you have a warm bath or shower temperature, it brings the heat from the core of your body to the surface, which naturally cools the body and helps to promote a better quality sleep. So that's why sometimes you might have heard of the routine book, bath, bed, or bath, book, bed, which is because of this bath potentially helping to cool down our core body temperature. It's also can just be relaxing for people. But, just remember, try to avoid too much stimulating blue light at night. So it is something to think about with the screens maybe not being as much a part of your routine. Also, improve the sleep environment. So trying to keep, we already talked about light, but try to make it as dark as possible. If you have a lot of light streaming in from the street or something like that that's disrupting you, you might want to wear one of those sleep masks, or you might want to get some blackout curtains and try that out. Background sounds may relax some people, but the volume has to be low, because if the volume is too loud, people can have more awakenings and it can prevent transitions into deeper stages of sleep. White noise tends to be safe, or pink noise, but make sure the volume again isn't too loud. I would avoid anything like ocean sounds if you can, just because they can be a little more disruptive. But if it works for you, it works for you. Also, extreme temperatures and sleeping environments can disrupt sleep. There's kind of some back and forth in the literature about what the best temperature is for sleep. There's some research that indicates maybe somewhere between 66 and 69 degrees. But really, it's just more of, we don't want it to be very, very cold, because in very cold temperatures, we could be deprived almost entirely of REM sleep. And of course, heat, right, makes it very hard for a core body temperature to cool down enough to get into those deeper stages of sleep. So quiet, dark, and cool bedroom. Keep the TV out. Hide the clock from view, or just a few tips. Now we get to beverages. Alcohol is popular. I mentioned it earlier. It acts as a mild sedative, and it makes it easier for people to fall asleep. But the problem with it is that the sedative quality is only temporary. As our liver enzymes metabolize alcohol, which usually takes a few hours depending on how much you drank, it begins to stimulate the parts of the brain that signal arousal, which causes more frequent awakenings and sleep problems in the night. And this very much interferes with REM sleep. And REM sleep is extremely important for your sleep quality and your overall well-being. So to be on the safe side, it's recommended that people stop drinking alcohol 4 hours before bedtime. Again, once in a while, I understand people gotta live, but just recognize that if you are having a lot of trouble with your sleep and you're having a cocktail or two right before bed, this could be a factor, and you may just want to try for a week or two, seeing what happens if you had that cocktail more like at dinner time. I probably don't need to explain caffeine, but it is a stimulant, and one of the other problems with it is that it's considered an adenosine blocker, which, remember, is that sleepiness chemical, right? It's a chemical in our brains that helps us to feel sleepy. But the problem is that caffeine tricks adenosine receptors, and it attaches to them, where those receptors would normally make you feel sleepy and have drowsiness happening throughout the day, slowly building that sleep pressure. Caffeine can block those, and then suddenly when it wears off, you're hit with a wall of adenosine, right, with sleepiness chemical, which makes us to feel very tired, right? And so that's kind of the issue with the caffeine crash, and it's really recommended that you limit all caffeine to the morning, and definitely like by 2 p.m. cut it off. Also, if you're using the restroom a lot at night, which is honestly pretty normal to get up once or twice to use the restroom, but you might want to avoid all fluids a couple hours before bedtime, because it could break your sleep cycle if you drank a lot and then, fluids, and then you got to wake up and use the restroom. It could interrupt your REM. And my last tip for you all is just to be careful with commercial sleep trackers. First of all, these devices can be very helpful for many people. It can get people to self-monitor their sleep and, be aware of some challenges they may have, at least pay attention more to it and prioritize it, which I appreciate, and also potentially change modifiable factors that are related to their sleep. But some of the issues with it, first of all, it can provide inaccurate data. So it tends to overestimate awakenings. It also kind of makes people freak out about their awakenings, which again, very normal to have multiple awakenings throughout the night. We just don't remember them a lot of the time. and even remembering one or two is no issue. They also don't accurately represent REM sleep most of the time. It's almost impossible for a commercial sleep tracker to do that. It can also modify your perception of your sleep. So maybe you feel refreshed in the morning, but you look at your sleep tracker and it looks like you were awake so much of the night. You might start to think, oh gosh, I didn't sleep as well as I thought. Should I be tired? Is there something wrong with me? Do I have an irreversible sleep debt? Right? And we can start to worry about that. And when we start to worry about our sleep goals and our sleep quality too much, it can make our bedtime anxiety worse. And for some people, there's been kind of this new phenomenon of orthosomnia, which is an unhealthy obsession with achieving the perfect sleep that is driven by sleep tracker data. And that was coined by some researchers at Rush University and Northwestern. But really, that doesn't help us to fall asleep. I already talked to you all earlier about how sleep does not reward effort, right? And it can really create a lot of anxiety about our sleep when we focus too much on the data in these trackers. And also, think of trackers like a scale. You can stand on a scale every day and it will not make you lose weight. People spend hundreds of dollars on sleep devices, but then they won't shut off their phones and go to bed or have a schedule or work on any of these other techniques. So in and of itself, it can't. And I would just view sleep trackers, again, not that they're bad, just view them as a broad overview of your sleep health as opposed to drawing a whole lot of conclusions. So you don't want to be thinking to yourself, oh gosh, I only got 2 hours of deep sleep. What is that? That's a bad thing. What does that mean? Sleep architecture takes care of itself, right? If you focus on the strategies that we talked about, you may have more deep sleep on one night than another, and that's completely normal. So try to avoid drawing these minute conclusions about your sleep health because of these. Finally, I have a few additional resources for you all. This is the CBTI Coach app. It's a free app that has some of the relaxation techniques that I talked about earlier. It has a lot of information about sleep and insomnia and some of the things with these tips that I discussed. You'll often find some of that in the learning category of this app. But it's just a useful tool that's free. It's created by the VA and Stanford. It's evidence-based. This is a great book by a psychologist, Matthew Walker. It's called Why We Sleep. If you're interested in learning a lot more about, going into more depth about sleeping pills, for example, and some of the problems with those, and sleep architecture and the different stages of sleep, this has a wealth of information that's written for the layperson. It doesn't have to, you don't have to have a PhD to understand what's going on in this book, and I think it's a great resource. And he's a professor of neuroscience and psychology at UC Berkeley. I also wanted to share with you all, because I talked about CBTI a lot in this conversation, and again, it is the #1 recommended way to treat insomnia. And it's around Alabama, it can be hard to get a provider. Sometimes there's long wait lists, especially since COVID. A lot of people are having sleep problems. So I know the wait list here at UAB to get into CBTI can be, out until June or July right now. So I did want to mention to you guys about a clinical trial that's going on. If you do want to get access to CBTI and you're in a rural area, right? That's the only caveat, is that you have to be living in a rural area. There is a clinical trial going on to look at, CBTI versus medication or both. And if you're interested in that, I put the contact information for the research coordinator there. But I did think I'd mention it because it could be a way to get CBTI sooner than some of the waits that are out there if you feel like you're still struggling after trying some of these techniques. And they pay you as opposed to you paying them. So now I just want to get to some discussion and questions. If anyone uses Reddit, I would say I'm a clinical psychologist. You can ask me anything. And I'm also going to leave my contact information up while we are discussing. So.
Awesome. Great presentation, Megan. Thank you so much. I did drop in the chat a few things. I've dropped in the name of that app, the free useful tool, CBTI Coach app. Also a link to Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, if anybody's interested, as well as the link to the COZI study, which is cozistudy.org. So go ahead, check those resources out. As for the questions, let's just start from the bottom. Does the sleep medicine former Governor Huckabee endorses work as well as he says?
Which is it? I actually haven't heard about that.
Eric, if you can drop the name of that drug in, we will see if that works. After hearing all these health risks, this person feels that they need to go sleep right now. They're curious if you can truly catch up on sleep, and if so, would it alleviate some of these risks?
Yeah, so that's been a really important question in the literature for a while now is can we truly ever catch up on a sleep debt? And what I would tell you is that it's maybe not possible to catch up on like fully on a sleep debt. But if you have like a bad night or two, let's say even like 24 hours without sleep, and it would take kind of like what you don't want to do is try to sleep like 10 hours the next night, right? You want to get back to a normal circadian type of schedule with that consistent wake time right away. But it may take like a week or so to make up, quote unquote, for that lost sleep. But you can, right? And we start to see cognitive functioning returning closer to baseline at that point in time. But sometimes for like a 24-hour period where you didn't sleep, it could take like a week or so to get back to like your cognitive abilities baseline.
Is it normal to make noises that can wake you up right as you're falling asleep?
For you yourself to make noises, I would say I'm not sure about that question. Definitely something that happens a lot is right as you're about to fall asleep, other noises in your environment can wake you up. That could be like a bedtime partner. I know I have a 9-month-old, and certainly the monitor, even like little sounds, can wake me up. So background noise can certainly, I know people's pets, I know some people have cats that like play around, they're nocturnal. So those noises can wake you up. And I think it's possible that you yourself making a noise could wake you up. If it's something like snoring, that also begs the question of like, if you're having frequent snoring and you're waking up a lot, it would beg the question of, do I need to get a sleep study to check out something like obstructive sleep apnea?
So blue light blocking glasses, stay away from, not advisable, correct?
Well, I would definitely say that during the daytime, there's no reason for them whatsoever, because you actually want a lot of exposure to broad spectrum blue light during the day. It actually keeps us stimulated. It helps build up that sleep pressure. So, looking at screens is not necessarily a bad thing, especially during the day. You can always try them out at night, but the evidence base for them is still, not quite there yet. So they're still being researched.
Europeans are very surprised that we watch TV, read books, do all these things in our bed. So basically exclude everyday activities from the bedroom, kind of.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. There's certainly people who can do things in their bed all day long and their sleep is never impacted. They're sleeping great at night. They're not reporting any problems with their sleep. So if that's you, but I doubt it if you're at this webinar, but if it were, that's fine, right? But if you are having difficulty with your sleep, I would definitely suggest, especially if you're putting your head to the pillow and your brain just starts to go through everything that that you're worried about and you're activated, I would definitely say that's a cue to you to try avoiding all things that are like daytime activities in your bed.
If you have a routine where you're consistently waking up at a certain time, but then you sleep in for one day, will that completely throw you off, or can you get back on track?
Yeah, I really like that question because I think it kind of gets at something I hope I've embodied to you all. I do not want to strike fear into anyone's hearts that even one single night of doing something wrong, with these guidelines is going to throw you off forever, or that you're doomed. And that's absolutely not the case. I was just telling Greg earlier that even as a psychologist who knows all this stuff, especially as a psychologist who knows all this stuff, I still have to live, right? So 80% of the time I'm doing what's best for my health, and 20% of the time I'm a human. So if you have a really fun graduation party to attend one night and you're going to sleep in some the next day, then that's just fine. Just try, to get right back on track with that normal wake time as soon as you can, like the next day.
Does sleeping position, backside, stomach make any difference?
That's a good question. I don't know the literature in that. What I do know is that for pregnant women, the claims are overblown in that area, so that actually you just want to sleep whatever's most comfortable for you. I would imagine that that's the case for non-pregnant people as well, that just sleep in the position that's most comfortable for you, but I don't know the literature in that area.
Is melatonin a good sleep aid? And if so, does taking it an hour before affect the production of your own body to make melatonin?
I'm so glad that someone mentioned melatonin, because that is something that I could have devoted a lot of time to, and I didn't feel like I had enough time today. But that's a question I get asked a lot about. The issue with melatonin is that it's actually not intended as a sleep aid for insomnia, right? it doesn't really work in that way. So research has shown that it doesn't necessarily like conk us out or anything like that, like a lot of people think. Melatonin is a hormone that regulates the timing of sleep, right? It doesn't help us to feel sleepy necessarily. All it does is to help us to feel sleepy at the right time. So one of the times that it could be useful to take melatonin is if you're jet lagged, right? So that you can try to get your circadian back on the right time faster. But my other concern about melatonin is that it's not FDA regulated, right? And there have been studies that show that what we think we're getting in melatonin, like the dose, for instance, can be extremely variable, where you may be taking a lot more or a lot less than you think. And they've also found some serotonin, in the studies, which is actually an issue because that's a hormone, a neurotransmitter that, regulates your mood, right? So it's not really something that would be evidence-based recommendation from me.
So is a bad dream from bad sleep behavior or something for a head doctor? I mean, this person says they have a reputation of dead relatives visiting their dreams.
Okay. They said, sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. So bad dream, is it from bad sleeping or something from that needs to go to a head doctor? They say
nightmares.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Good question. So, nightmares are not necessarily a sign that you have a psychological disorder. So I do want to point that out. There are certain psychological disorders that where people will have more of a tendency to have nightmares, like something like PTSD, anxiety disorders and things like that. They certainly make us more prone to that. But having some nightmares here and there can be extremely normal as just like a function of REM sleep. And in fact, REM sleep and having those nightmares, there's kind of a theoretical basis that it's helping us to potentially prepare for difficult situations in our life and to help us to regulate our emotions. So if it happens at night, it helps us to be better prepared the next day. So as long as they're not causing you a lot of disrupted sleep or problems, it's not something that you necessarily have to worry about.
And just real quickly, how much REM sleep is needed again at night?
So in a normal or healthy sleep architecture, you would want to see about 15 to 20% of your night being REM sleep. Now that again can vary, right? You can't, like, your brain is going to help determine the menu of sleep stages for that night, right? That is something that is regulated by our circadian rhythm. And it's not necessarily something that you can control or should even worry about, right? Because your brain knows the exact percentage that you need. So if you are waking up at the same time daily, building sleep pressure and things like that, your brain knows, hey, I actually need a little more REM sleep tonight, so I'm going to get like over 20%. And that's something that's involuntary and we can't really regulate or change that ourselves.
And the last question, because we're up against 1 o'clock, and what I'll do is I'll send you the questions that we didn't get asked.
Sure.
We'll put those online. But the last question, it goes back to the first one, is the drug was Relaxium. Do you know anything about Relaxium?
Okay, I do not know anything about that drug, right? One of the things about me as a psychologist is it's hard for me to go in depth about medications and drugs, so I don't always know the latest drugs, but that's one I don't know, and I don't want to tell you something right or wrong.
Well, we went on and end on a positive note. So is it common not to recall dreams?
Yes, actually,
Perfect.
that is common. Yeah, and it kind of just depends on where you wake up, but it or when and where, but it's not necessarily an issue to not recall dreams.
Awesome. Dr. Hayes, thank you so much for being with us.
All right, thank you so much.
You are so welcome. And just a reminder, a recording of today's webinar will be uploaded onto our website by tomorrow. As an attendee, you will get an email with a replay link to let you know when it's ready. And in a moment, I'll let you know what webinars we have coming up for you to watch and an opportunity for you to let us know how we're doing. But first, I'd like to invite you to UAB Unite Day on Saturday, this Saturday. March 4th, we'll be at the Birmingham Glen Iris Elementary, just a few blocks away from campus. Volunteer with us as we work to spruce up the school and its grounds. We'll provide supplies for you to help out, but you can bring your own tools if you think you need them. Join us at 8 Saturday morning. Breakfast and lunch will be provided to our volunteers. Sign up to give back at alumni.uab.edu/Unite Day. Meanwhile, in April, be part of our 17th annual scholarship run presented by Viva Health. This year's run will be hosted at the Battery in Homewood on Saturday, April 15th. Join us to raise money for scholarships. We have a 5K, 10K option, as well as a virtual run for non-runners or alumni who are not in the Birmingham area. Early bird registration ends this weekend, so sign up now. Register at alumni.uab.edu/5K10K. As promised, here's a look at a few upcoming webinars. On Thursday, March 9th, come back for Preparing Your Houseplants for Spring. Caitlin Hastings, a UAB alum and founder of Botanica Houseplant Shops and Botanica Plantscaping Consultants, will show us ways we can liven up our homes this spring. On Tuesday, March 21st, we will host Dr. David Schwebel and Kath Morgan for I Believe There is a Hero in All of Us, Superheroes and Risk-Taking Behavior in Young Children. During this webinar, we'll explore how the superhero culture can affect our children. On Tuesday, April 4th, Families on the Go should join us for Healthy Eating Meets Healthy Activity for Busy Families. Dr. Doug Mollering, who is actually attending today's webinar, will share 10 tips for healthy meals, which carbs are best, and how you can get your kiddos to eat their veggies. And on Thursday, April 13th, we begin a series geared towards parents of young youth athletes. The first webinar in the series is Burnout in Youth Sports, Why Specialization is Not So Special. Dr. Kelvin Spellman will take a look at how singling out a sport at an early age can have adverse effects on your kids. You can register for these and take a look at more at alumni.uab.edu/events. And before you go, share your thoughts on today's podcast. What did you like about it? What would you like to see? That QR code on your screen will take you to a very brief survey. Please take time to fill it out. Let us know how we're doing. Once again, thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. And as always, go Blazers.